They buried this stone to save oil. The pry bar slipped, the seal cracked, air hissed like a snake in a bottle. A stone cylinder sat in the dark, gray-black, carved with channels that drank the flashlight beam. Someone touched it. It hummed, not loud like a cat purring through a wall. The guard leaned in and whispered, "We don't log this." The door slammed. Lights died. Hours earlier, a routine dig pulled up ceramics that shouldn't exist, fused like glass with copper freckles. If the readings were right, the story of heat, of fuel, of oil, had a hole. We followed the hole. What they buried wasn't myth. It was a threat to business. The first clue surfaces. They were looking for storage pits. Instead, under a crust of wind-hardened sand, they found a stripe of mud brick and a scatter of ceramic that rang wrong when tapped. Sun hammered the trench. A field tech wetted a shard, rubbed it with her thumb, and stopped. The surface wasn't fired clay. It was glass, half-melted, the way bottles look after a campfire, but with veins of copper frozen in the flow. She called it in. The supervisor shrugged. Desert kilns get hot. She said kilns don't do this. Stakes were small at first. Catalog it, bag it, move on. But the lab came back confused. The charcoal dust trapped in the ceramic pores dated centuries older than the layers around it. Meanwhile, the copper specks weren't impurities. They were traces of smelted metal that had wicked into the clay during some intense thermal event. That meant heat, not just high but controlled, had touched this place twice, when the pot was made and later when something far hotter washed over it. A Geiger counter chirped once, then went quiet. The junior on meter duty frowned, shook the device, tapped it, and watched the needle settle. That afternoon, a malfunction memo slid into the binder. He kept the printout of the blip anyway, folded into his pocket like a guilty receipt. The site diary picked up a string of little details that didn't look like a story until they sat next to each other. A patch of sand fused into a glaze. A thin line of charcoal that shouldn't burn in a wind like this, unless it was shielded. A ring of stones discolored on their undersides. Heat had been here, but it didn't leave the scorch pattern of open flame. It pooled and moved like water. What nobody on the ground knew was that a graduate student, staring at a grainy PDF in a city archive across the sea, put a red dot on the same spot without meaning to. The file was a 197's regional survey, misfiled under acoustics. It mentioned vitrified earthenware of uncertain provenance in a footnote. The coordinates were off by a kilometer. The image was bad, but the phrase stuck, and she emailed the team on a whim. The reply was a single photo of the glassy shard on a notebook page and 5 words. "We have one like this." Now there were stakes. If you can show a repeatable pattern, vitrification here, copper bleed there, charcoal skewed the same way, you move from anomaly to process. And process implies design. Design implies a technology. The tech didn't use wood or coal the way we think of fuel. It left signatures that looked like engineered heat, concentrated, directed, and held. 3 days later, windstorm. The trench walls rattled. A protective tarp came loose and snapped like a flag. The night team secured the lines, then noticed a shallow cavity where sand had slumped out from under a crust. Inside, the roof of a small chamber caught the flashlight like a mirror. The stone had glossed. Across a crack, the gloss broke in waves as if heat had lapped and receded. In one corner, a greenish drip was frozen mid-run, copper glass, not ore. Someone wrote tire. And put a question mark, knowing it was wrong and maybe not wrong at the same time. The human part of this moved quietly. The field tech with the Geiger counter met the graduate student on a video call from the back of a pickup, engine idling for the air condition. He held the shard up to the camera and turned it. She held her printout to the screen. Vitrified earthenware, underlined twice. He told her about the blip. She told him about a librarian who'd said the 197 survey had a companion box that never came back from a loan. They promised to keep each other in the loop, then both checked over their shoulders without meaning to. A week brought a visitor with polite shoes and an ID badge that didn't match any agency on the permit. He smiled, took photos, and complimented the field sanitation. The next day, a local contractor delivered extra fencing out of nowhere. Nobody asked for it. They put it up anyway. Meanwhile, the lab found something the eye missed. The ceramic glass held microbubbles aligned like the grain in wind-blown dunes. That meant the heat didn't just melt, it moved through. In modern labs, you see that when you run heat across material in a controlled gradient, the report didn't say heat pump. That would be absurd. It said anomalous heat flow indicators consistent with directional thermal transfer. This was the moment the story stopped being about pots and turned into a map. The graduate student dug deeper into the 197's archive and found 3 more footnotes in unrelated journals. Ethnography here, hydrology there, each mentioning vitrified material near old caravan paths. She took clear tracing paper, drew the routes, and overlaid dots where vitrification had been noted. The line wasn't straight, but it favored water and markets, not shrines, not random. Back on site, a monsoon teased the horizon and broke with no rain, just humidity and lightning. The chamber air stayed strangely steady, not cool, not hot, constant. The junior stuck a cheap thermometer in a crack and forgot it. 2 hours later, the ambient had jumped with the storm. The chamber reading didn't. He wrote temperatures stable despite exterior heat and underlined it, then added. He never used those question marks in a field note. He kept using them. The stakes sharpened in the gut before they did on paper. If heat could be moved and stored without burning, the whole idea of fuel as fortune wobbled. From there, paranoia is just prudence by another name. A malfunction logged, a bad map that fits too well, a stranger at the fence. The first clue surfaced with a glint. It wasn't alone. The hidden map of heat. While the trench crew taped tarps against the wind, the graduate student spread a mess of photocopies across a dorm desk and did something nobody at the site had time for. She started plotting. The misfiled 197 survey gave her a first point. 3 odd footnotes from scattered journals gave her 3 more. She laid translucent sheets, trade routes in faded ink, river courses, caravanserai ruins, and pressed them together under a library book. The dots didn't fall on temples. They rode the old arteries of movement. Stakes snap into focus when patterns refuse to be coincidence. If vitrified bits cluster where people once hauled grain, bronze, and stories, you're not dealing with a one-off ritual bonfire. You're looking at infrastructure. Infrastructure means intention. Intention means someone built this to do something repeatable for people who needed it, and needed it where it mattered, along the routes that fed cities. She emailed a stitched image of her overlay to the field tech with the Geiger blip. He opened it on his phone in the shadow of the fence and let out a low, unprintable word. The nearest dot to their trench hugged a dry wadi that had been an aqueduct long before pipes. Another dot sat beside a ruined market wall locals used as a windbreak. In between, nothing that modern maps respected. And still, the line curved as if it knew the gradient of the land. Meanwhile, something else was happening in a basement far from the dust. A retired cartographer who had spent a life drafting survey sheets nobody reads twice pulled a roll of tracing paper from a tube he hadn't opened in 20 years. He'd kept it for no reason he could justify to anyone but himself. On it in pencil, he'd drawn a handmade overlay from a government contract he never quite forgot. A scatter of heat-affected substrates the brief had told him to code as geomorph anomalies. He'd added a note in the margin. "Breath of stone." It was a phrase from a temple inscription he'd copied on leave, the kind of poetic aside that used to get him laughed at in staff meetings. He snapped a photo and posted it to a small forum where old map guys argue about fonts. The graduate student found it by accident at 2 in the morning and froze. What nobody knew at the time was that the cartographer's overlay had a detail that would matter later. His dots fell not only along routes, but at a regular spacing relative to water sources. Not perfect, not machine-made, but measured. Every third valley, every day's walk nodes, that's not worship, that's logistics. They started cross-referencing like people possessed. The student pulled temple inscriptions from scanned corpora, searching for that odd phrase. Across languages and centuries, it kept showing up. Breath of stone, stones that warmed the night, halls that sang. A hymn described a winter festival where walls drank the sun and returned it to the old. The metaphors stacked around air and lungs and veins. Nobody was talking combustion. They were talking movement, of heat, of cold, as if the building itself breathed. The field team, boxed in by new fencing and polite security visits, did what you do when you can't dig. They listened. Microphones on the chamber floor, nothing fancy. At certain hours, a low-frequency sound threaded the noise, too regular to be wind through a crack, too stable to be a generator miles away. It matched the faint vibration they'd felt. The graduate student sent back a line from a stele. "The hall's song keeps winter from the bones." They smiled, then stopped smiling. Language and sensor were humming the same note. Beneath the mapped dots, seismic consultants had long logged harmless anomalies, cavities that rang uniform under thumps. A friendly geologist owed the cartographer a beer and sent over raw traces. The cavities weren't natural pockets, their geometry repeated. Oval, consistent span, consistent roof thickness. The kind of regularity you get when you settle stone around a negative space with a plan. This was the moment everything changed. The pattern implied not scattered shrines, but a distribution network. Nodes along trade routes, likely tied into waterworks, may be sharing fluid and air to move thermal energy where people slept, bartered, and stored grain. You could keep a caravanserai dry in a monsoon, keep a storeroom cool at noon, keep a hall warm at dawn, all without smoke, if your cores breathed. Meanwhile, a small note from the cartographer. He'd once traced an inscription where breath of stone was paired with veins of cold. He'd chuckled then. He didn't now. The student overlaid aqueduct remnants, feeder channels, overflow drains, silted cisterns onto her dot route map. The node sat where water could do double duty: drink, bathe, exchange heat. Stakes rose with every confirm. If they'd built a network to move heat like goods, then the thing in the chamber wasn't an idol, it was a component. And if it was a component, there had to be more. The team listed candidate nodes within a day's drive. They circled one near the coast where fishermen still dried nets overnight in humid season. The cartographer circled the same spot on his old pencil sheet. What none of them could see yet was who else had circled it too. The stone that hums. They pried at dusk because the mortar went brittle when the heat bled off and the wind finally slept. The slab coughed dust, the chamber exhaled like a cellar after a long winter, and the flashlight slid over a shape in the center, basalt, gray-black, not pretty, built to work. Shallow spirals crossed its skin, channels like someone had taught a stream to write. Metal gleamed in those grooves, thin inlays, not corroded junk, not village bronze. It looked like a watch refusing to brag. Stakes hit the chest before the page. If this did what the map implied, it wasn't a relic, it was hardware. A junior reached out with the back of his knuckles. No sting, just a tremor under skin, tiny and stubborn. He flattened his palm. The vibration wasn't sound, it was insistence. "It's alive," he whispered, then smiled at himself and didn't move his hand. Notes flipped from adjectives to numbers. Threshold air, 31. Chamber, 25. Core surface, 26, then 26 again, while the night up top breathed hotter from a late heat burst. Temperatures stable despite exterior heat moved from a question mark to a line they'd circled twice. They taped thermocouples, one on basalt, one on the chamber wall, one outside in shade. Over hours, outside swung 3 degrees. Inside, the core drifted and returned like a metronome. No one could throw off beat. The supervisor climbed down, set her palm on stone, and jerked, not burned, rattled. The hum went bone to tooth, a low patience that made you aware of your own pulse. She looked at the doorway, then the team, then wrote the coward's phrase you write when you're afraid to write working. Faint vibration reported, check instrument interference. She ordered a soft cordon and softer silence. "No chatter," she said. "We log samples, not songs." One junior ignored the spirit, if not the letter. He propped his phone and hit record. You hear boots, breath, short jokes, and under it a bed tone, the far end of a train you can't see. Later cleaned, the stripe sat constant. No generator upwind does that. He didn't send the audio. He copied time stamps into a notebook and left the file unnamed. They shaved a smear from a metal inlay. Under the scope, ratios leaned nickel-copper with a whisper of platinum group trace. Not treasure effort. Slow-cooling dendrites feathered across the grain. The metal had been persuaded along a gradient. The grooves weren't decoration, they were roots. Language helped more than it should. Breath of stone, veins of cold. The carved channels made the metaphors mechanical. The spirals ran from a central well to the skin and back, like an inhale and an exhale frozen into rock. Someone followed them with a penlight, tracing where a fluid might go if it had reason. Meanwhile, the chamber behaved like a patient you could trust. Humidity climbed outside. Inside, it stayed polite. A droplet on the shadow side fattened and held, the bright side stayed dry. Asymmetry like that happens when you're pulling heat from one face and pushing it to the other. Not magic. Thermodynamics coaxed. Stakes sharpened because this was demonstration, not argument. Put your hand on basalt and feel steadiness while the world wobbles. Tell me fuel is fortune. The graduate student emailed the cartographer a quick sketch of the spirals. He sent back 2 words and arrows. Counterflow? In modern exchangers, counterflow is how you cheat losses. Here, Rock taught air a trick. The supervisor tightened the circle. She invoked artifact integrity and closed access. She asked for a crate with shock mounts, desiccant, a lock. She pocketed a card a polite stranger had left weeks earlier and didn't call. "We stabilize, document, pause," she told the crew. Pens hovered. Material analysis added a phrase nobody expected. Composite nucleation sites. Tiny inclusions, silicates seeded with metallic dust, sat at regular spacing beneath the surface. That's how you tell phase changes where to start. In a kiln, overkill. In a breathing core, control. The lab lead wrote like she was apologizing to the past. Microstructure inconsistent with local metallurgy. Human moments kept pace. A generator coughed to a stop up top. The chamber didn't care. The guard from day one leaned in, eyes on the doorway, and murmured, "We don't log this." The junior looked at his notebook, then the stone, and understood the price of erasure. They stumbled into a test by accident. A dust devil rode the trench and spat grit toward the mouth. They hung a tarp to keep the chamber clean, pinched airflow without meaning to. The hum deepened a notch you felt in your sternum. Core surface rose a fraction toward ambient, then eased back as if the stone took a deeper breath and returned to its set point. Notes read responsive to airflow restriction. And then no conclusion, because caution becomes habit when eyes are on the fence. They confirmed one more oddity. Hair laid across a groove lifted strand by strand as if a faint skin of air skated along the channel. A spice pinch of dust moved not upward but around, tracing the spiral. The junior grinned without joy. "It's moving," he said. The supervisor didn't smile. "It's working," she said, and immediately regretted saying it out loud. This was the thing the text had promised and the map had hinted, a basalt heart with metal veins tuned to move heat without flame. As they whispered about a proper test, sealed box, pressure nudges, condensate trap, the radio cracked with new voices they didn't recognize. Tires rattled over gravel that hadn't known traffic in weeks. The hum in the chamber kept time like it didn't care. Up top, boots matched a different metronome. The interruption. They rolled in with clean trucks and courtesy, doors thudding like files closing. Logo said heritage protection in a serif that made everyone stand straighter. Vests, not uniforms. Same boots, same radios. The lead smiled like a hotel manager. "We're here to secure the site. Your permit indicates cultural sensitivity. We'll need the artifact stabilized and transferred." Stakes hit as paperwork, not shouts. Custody meant chain of evidence. Chain meant removal. The supervisor asked for the order. They produced a letter on ministry crest with a stamp none of us had seen. The attaché used the right words, stewardship, integrity, best practices, and slid a folded sheet to the supervisor that wasn't in the packet. She didn't open it with eyes on her. While polite voices floated in the trench, the kitchen phone rang at a scientist's house. He was stirring eggs when the administrator's tone thinned. "We're suspending on-site analysis pending compliance review." His hand slipped. The skillet hit tile. He dialed the lab. By noon, his badge read red. His email bounced back with errors he'd never seen. The nonprofit fronting the heritage action looked clean, grant speak about restoration, smiling schoolchildren by lintels. A junior ran the board list and found day jobs tied to energy lobbying. The address landed on a glass floor tower where oil finance held lunches. Tasteful shell. Pipeline money. The first thing they seized wasn't the stone, it was the frame. "Initial assessment suggests a ritual acoustics device," the attaché said for the record. The phrase slid into their notes like it was reserved seating. Acoustics sounded safe. It turned hum into chant and thermal stability into folklore. Camera angles missed the thermocouple tape. Microphones never crossed the sill. They pulled the permit on a clause nobody reads until someone weaponizes it. Emergency protection of threatened heritage. The emergency was ours. Foam and gauze wrapped the basalt like a patient. A security man photographed our notebooks and told us we couldn't keep originals. "Standard archiving," he said, and distributed NDAs that clicked like metronomes. "This protects you." A voicemail surfaced like a lifeline. The junior who'd recorded the tone listened to a calm, unlisted voice. "Courtesy, do not transmit digital files. If you must keep anything, write it down." The call ended. He looked at the unnamed audio file, then at the paper times. He slid the notebook paper into his boot. Meanwhile, scaffolding rose like theater. Mesh draped the chamber mouth. A sign went up, erosion risk in 3 languages. Traffic cones lined a track nobody drove. They staged caution and called it care. We read the nonprofit's filings after midnight. One name reappeared, a committee veteran who'd pushed to label district thermal systems non-competitive curiosities in a standards draft years back. The language rhymed with the new line, ritual acoustics. Turn a working device into culture and engineers lose keys. A friend inside a ministry texted a single line, funding disclosed via donor-advised conduit tied to petroleum endowment. The supervisor exhaled, folded the message under the private note the attaché had slipped her. That letter, we'd learn, offered a package. Secure the site, provide jobs, build a visitor center, immediate transfer to a partner trust. The trust's mailing address matched the glass floor. The human cost arrived fast. Our night guard, the Whisperer, was reassigned. Rotation. The village elder who boiled tea every day asked why we wrapped a hole when the sky was clear. We didn't have a clean answer. At the city lab, couriered samples acquired new labels. A code moved them to ethnographic ceramics. Microbubbles, aligned grain, annotations vanished under a rubber stamp. No further analysis recommended. Drawers that had held curiosity now held closure. When the trucks rolled with the basalt heart under blankets, the story had hardened. Shrine acoustics, sonic masonry, cultural significance. That last word wasn't wrong. It just bent the arrow away from heat moving without flame. A micro-story hit like a dropped cup. The lead scientist stood at his sink, staring at his palms gone egg-slick, when his kid asked if he was going to the desert tomorrow. "Not today," he said. He rinsed his hands and dried them on a towel that suddenly felt disposable. Unknown to them, across town, a retired cartographer pulled a long-guarded pencil overlay and laid it beside the trust's press image on his tablet. Node spacing matched aqueduct remnants that the rendering had erased with tasteful landscaping. He muttered to himself, "They're airbrushing the lungs." The attaché did one more lap through our trench with a sympathetic nod. "We appreciate your diligence," he said. "You'll be credited in our report." The supervisor tested the weight of the folded private letter in her pocket. Jobs, fences, a donor wall. Her eyes went to the doorway once more, and she said to nobody, "We log samples, not songs." The hum behind the mesh continued at a pitch they didn't measure. This decision would haunt us because it reframed a device as Dacre. And once a song becomes quaint, you can silence it with velvet rope. The 1899 letter. The paper was brittle, the ink brown as dried tea. The heading read simply, New York, December 12, 1899. The signature at the bottom carried a name that owned wells and newspapers. The line that mattered sat in the middle like a fuse. Reports of electrical airs threaten the future of kerosene in domestic heat. Electrical airs, not electricity, not wires. Air moved by force you didn't burn. Stakes jumped centuries when a man who sold light from liquid worries about warmth without flame. The letter wasn't a manifesto, it was direction. He asked an associate to ascertain feasibility and purchase rights where prudent, divert efforts were necessary. Purchase rights meant buy patents. Divert efforts meant starve labs. He listed 3 cities where unfortunate enthusiasms had taken root. He underlined one, an institute testing thermal wells. Behind it sat a clipped geology journal that never made it past its first issue. The editorial apologized for terminological confusion and pulled a paper describing ground-coupled shafts that lifted heat from the earth in winter and exhaled excess heat in summer. A footnote translated a phrase from a temple lintel, breath of stone. The journal folded a month later. The printer hadn't been paid. The author accepted a university post teaching mining law. 3 days after a patent filing on thermal wells, a brick lab burned at dawn. Fire brigade notes called it electrical in origin. A neighbor swore he'd heard footsteps on the stairs at 3 and then nothing. The insurance file closed as faulty apparatus. One drawing survived. A shaft lined with ceramic rings, a bronze manifold on top, a crosshatched core the draftsman labeled lattice. The term would matter later. If you're wondering why an oil baron would care about moving heat, remember 1899 heat. Coal ovens, kerosene heaters, prosperity in barrels. A system that turned ground and air into a loop didn't nibble at profits. It questioned whether energy had to come from a hole someone owned. Barons didn't need coefficients. They understood markets. Heat without fuel was heat without them. Letters like that produce action. Archives show buyouts that look polite. Interests secured here, strategic partnership there. Trustees with coal and oil ties steered students toward combustion chemistry. Young engineers who wrote about non-combustion heat movement found fellowships rescoped to boiler efficiency. The same industrialist funded a chair in industrial thermodynamics that published on vapor compression driven by coal power, not ground air exchange. Meanwhile, a librarian kept a clipping file labeled electrical airs and added a circular from a consortium offering to integrate heritage stonework preservation with urban heat standards. It sounded generous. In practice, it reclassified thermal chambers as cultural artifacts, fenced from tinkerers. An 1899 bathhouse renovation drawing shows vents bricked, channels filled, a pencil note. Prevent drafts, install coal stove. A small machinist story makes it human. An Ohio tinkerer, inspired by the withdrawn paper, fitted copper tubing to a pit and ran it through a junkyard radiator. His wife wrote that the kitchen stayed warm with less coal. He filed for a patent. An appliance affiliate of an oil firm sent a representative and bought the rights. The machinist moved near a foundry. The patent never surfaced. 2 years later, the company launched a new coal stove. The letter didn't kill a technology. It set tone. Divert efforts where necessary turned into a template. Labs were realigned. Journals folded with dignified goodbyes. The phrase insufficient practical interest crept into municipal standards meetings. As standards hardened, builders wrote to code. Code required flues, not lungs. Stones that breath disappeared from plans because the form didn't have a box for them. A later margin joke reveals the unease. Engineers scribbled veins of cold next to equations about latent heat. A Swiss pamphlet on vapor recompression mocked medieval heat stones. The laughter wasn't just condescension. It was nerves dressed as wit. You laugh at what threatens your training. A second letter in 1902 tightened the frame. Same hand, cooler tone. Public must be persuaded that fuel equals warmth. It reads like marketing copy today, but then it was policy. Advertisements followed, glossy illustrations of healthy families by blue kerosene flames, text about safe, modern comfort. A pamphlet warned that unvented air-moving contraptions were drafty and unsafe. The contraptions weren't listed or pictured. Numbers crept in where poetry had lived. City inspectors were handed checklists that named boilers and furnaces, then miscellaneous for everything else. Insurance tables penalized non-standard thermal installations. Premiums rose. A builder choosing between a flue and a breathing floor picked the line that passed inspection and kept premiums low. Habits set like plaster. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, district schemes flickered to life where oil's reach was thinner. Some used hot water from engines. Others experimented with boreholes for seasonal storage. When a cold winter made headlines, coal ads doubled. The editorials called for trusted fuels. A column praising air heat from Earth ran once and moved to the back page. The 1899 letter ends with a flourish that feels like prophecy. Our interest is civilization's comfort. Comfort framed as commodity. If comfort is something sold, then any device that makes it local looks like theft. A century later, when a nonprofit with tasteful fonts calls a working core ritual acoustics and wraps it in mesh, you can hear the echo. The tune was written when a barrel feared air that moved heat. Here's what nobody in that office could foresee. The words from lintels and manuals would survive as jokes and hymns, then manuals again. Breath of stone, veins of cold. They'd wait until someone touched basalt and felt a steadiness the wind couldn't shake. The letter tried to label the future. The stone ignored the label and kept humming. Texts that don't fit. To make sense of a humming stone and a map that behaved like a utility diagram, we open books nobody assigns anymore. Not epics, work lists, repair notes, winter hymns, marginal jokes. The graduate student read for verbs. What did things do? One hymn said, the stones drink the sun by day and breathe warmth at night. Another warned caretakers not to suffocate the hall, or the old will shiver. Breath, drink, thin. You don't talk like that about fire, you talk like that about exchange. Stakes cut closer because metaphors stacked around physics. Bellows, lungs, veins of cold. A monastery ledger from a rainy valley bragged. Walls never sweating even when the air weeps. Sweat means condensation. No sweat suggests dew point managed or air dried along a path. A coastal guild note told porters to brush the reeds from the throat. The sound dulls and heat grows lazy. Sound dulls when vents clog. Heat grows lazy when airflow drops. Folk language, mechanical behavior. We built a table only a nerd would love. Roots for breath across tongues, synonyms for vein, local words for cold, place names with stone, plus a yes-no for vitrified fragments from the overlay. The SS clustered along caravan stops and aqueduct stubs. Far from nodes, words slid back to smoke and fire. Where the network had once breathed, people still described buildings as if they lived. Comparative linguistics turned into a thermometer we didn't own. In one region, veins of cold shared a route with irrigation channels. In another, the word glossed as lungs also meant bays, spaces filling and emptying on a rhythm. A steel showed alternating lines zigzagging between two verticals. The cartographer tapped the scan and grinned like a kid who'd found a lost ruler. Counterflow, he said, not proof. A rhyme that mattered. A monk's marginalia read like a commissioning checklist. In monsoon, the bath walls remain dry, though the air wets the beard. Brother H says the stone sucks cold from the water channel and sends it to the floor. He says the hall sings when the west door is open and the east door is shut. When both are open, the song breaks. Pressure differentials, tuned by doors. A building as instrument. We kept hitting phrases engineers hear differently than poets. Stones that drink the sun could be radiant mass charged by day. The couplet ends, and feed the old at dawn. Dawn implies storage, not basking. Veins of cold sat next to instructions for sweeping the little holes beneath the steps each market day. If those were vents, the steps were plenums. The grad student underlined little holes and wrote maintenance schedule. What we'd missed before showed up as humor. A coastal satire mocked a merchant who blocked the hall's nose with crates, forcing the stone to pant and sweat like a mule. Block the intake, spike humidity, lose effectiveness. A city ordinance fined bathkeepers whose floors wept, citing neglect of the veins. Neglect implies a fix you already know. Clean the lattice, clear the throat, set the doors. The vocabulary drifted with the overlay. Early inscriptions were lofty, breath, song, sun drinking. Later manuals got practical, don't plug the throat, keep clay plates tight. Where vitrified traces thinned, language retreated to ash and smoke. Where nodes persisted, coastal warehouses, high monasteries, the metaphor stayed. Culture and hardware rose and sank together. A recipe for winter porridge made it domestic. Set the pot by the cool vein after supper, morning finds it sweet and thick, not sour. That's overnight cooling without ice. A midwife's note said, rest the cloth by the warm breath, it dries without smoke. Low temperature drying, no soot. Comfort as a service, invisible routine. Then the fragment that felt like a warning across time. If the temple must be emptied, seal the veins, quiet the breath, and bury the heart beneath the floor. Do not let the merchants see it, for they will sell its song. The room went quiet. It wasn't proof of a plot, it was awareness. They knew what pressure looked like. They hid what made pressure toothless. Meanwhile, our numbers started matching their verbs. The desert chamber's tone rose when we pinched airflow. A low line in a winter hymn praised the good song when the wind ran correctly. The word correctly sat there like a calibration note. In a different text, caretakers were told to judge by ear. If the pitch drifted, you swept reeds or reset a door. Acoustic feedback as operations manual. We found a repair log from a harbor. Bronze grids replaced, the floor now keeps old bones from creek. Bronze grids, lattice by another name. The cartographer circled the line and wrote, component swap recorded as liturgy. We laughed and then stopped. If you say a part aloud in ritual, you keep the part in memory. A last micro story made it personal. A monk complained. The steward hates the song and says it steals silence. He orders both doors open for quiet. The night crawls into the bones, we close one door after he sleeps. Sabotage by taste, fixed by habit. The physics didn't care about politics. The hall either breathed or it didn't. We didn't need blueprints anymore. We had behavior, maintenance, taboos, jokes, and timing. Put those next to a humming core, droplets moving the wrong way at room temperature, and a map that traced markets, not shrines. Speculation shrank. Stones that drink sun and breathe warmth at night, read like poetry until your palm met basalt and felt a steadiness the weather couldn't bully. Words told us how to listen. The next step was ugly and simple. Test the device the way the texts told us to run the hall, and do it before someone boxed the throat and called that safety. The unauthorized test. They waited for the mesh to stop twitching and the security truck's tail lights to sink behind the ridge. 3 of them slipped through the service gap they'd measured with a boot heel. No phone screens. 1 red headlamp cupped in a palm. They carried a coil of soft copper, 2 thermocouples, a hand-pumped vacuum jar, a bread loaf box with a gasketed lid, and a strip of paper chart. Analog only. If they were wrong, they just wasted sleep. If they were right, someone would call it unsafe. Stakes were clean. Either the core moved heat on command or the hum was a story. If it moved heat without fire, the mesh and the NDAs weren't about heritage. They were about control. They set the box over a smooth flank of basalt and warmed beeswax between fingers to seal the edge. 1 probe under the lip, taped down with fabric. The second on the chamber wall. Outside air sat heavy, damp. Inside, the hum held its line like a note you find by accident and don't want to lose. The junior whispered the plan the way you do when you're talking to yourself. Pull a mild vacuum so air surrenders heat faster. Watch for the wrong way move. Cooler air in the box giving up heat to a stone that refuses to drift. No motors, no wires, just a nudge and a read. He squeezed the hand pump. The needle slid down. A ghost of mist sketched the plexi and vanished. Nothing else for 10 seconds that felt like a minute. Then the copper coil on the opposite face grew a thin film that shouldn't have grown at this temperature. A bead fattened and slid into the little vial with a click you could hear. He flinched, then laughed once into his sleeve. Numbers started behaving like a confession. The box temperature dipped below ambient. The chamber wall followed slower, half a step behind. The core surface moved a hair, then returned to its stubborn number as if it had a favorite place to live. On the hot side, a dry halo widened, pushing humidity away. On the cool side, beads formed in tidy intervals, gathered and fell. The junior wrote without looking up, condensation at room temp, asymmetric, repeatable. They nudged airflow because the texts practically begged them. The supervisor pressed a palm to the tarp door, pinching the throat. The hum rose a notch you felt in your teeth. The box dipped another half-degree. The dry halo sharpened. She lifted her hand. The tone settled. The needle sighed back toward baseline. He underlined responsive to small pressure changes twice, then stopped himself from adding a third line. A second trial just to be sure. They opened the east slit a finger width. The note thinned, then smoothed. The condensation rhythm steadied like a metronome finding time. The graduate student whispered, "Good song," and didn't realize she'd lifted the line from a winter hymn until the junior smiled. The coil remained a witness, never a driver. No power fed it, it didn't care. It just caught the air's truth on metal. A drop jumped the lip with a silver throat and rang the vial again. "Hear that?" the junior said. "Proof you can feel." The supervisor didn't nod. She watched the chart creep and thought about who would call this a safety hazard. They took a quick COP estimate from the delta and the rate of condensation, crude enough to make a lab chair frown, good enough to make a city engineer lean forward. Better than it should be with no compressors. Not a miracle. A system doing what it was shaped to do. They broke nothing. They left no tape. They warmed the wax and wiped the stone with a cloth they'd pocket later. They were almost done when a radio snapped alive above them in a voice they didn't recognize, numbers that matched their grid square. A flashlight stuttered against mesh. Footsteps shuffled grit. Someone said, "Wind again." Someone else said, "Log the check." They pressed themselves flat under the sill and counted heartbeats until the boots moved away. When they slid out, the supervisor tore the paper tape, folded lengths into her sock, and said what she'd say for weeks. "Analog only. If you wrote it, hide it where a hard drive can't find it." The junior pulled the vial, held it up, then pushed it into his pocket like it might sing. The graduate student snapped the beeswax edge off the box and palmed the broken ring as if a jury would one day want to see it. They stashed the coil. They erased their footprints with a broom they didn't bring, tucked under a tarp by someone who'd known they'd need it. Up top, a linen jacket smiled through the mesh in the morning and called their experiment threats to cultural integrity. He offered stipend roles at a visitor center, NDAs with tasteful margins. 2 signatures showed up that afternoon on someone else's paper. The junior signed nothing and kept walking. Meanwhile, a second set of notes already sat off-site, misfiled in a corner copy shop behind a fishing magazine. Another set rode the mail, postmarked by a bored clerk. The hum in the chamber didn't care. It held steady, a metronome under sand. Stakes had changed. Anomalies can be argued. Behavior can't. A stone that dried one face and wet the other at room temperature with a gentle pressure nudge didn't care about brochures or fonts. It wanted air and a path. They left the chamber with one more decision in their pockets. Who to tell first that a city could breathe without fuel if it remembered how to listen? The network hypothesis. By dawn, the dots stopped being curios and started behaving like a forgotten utility. The cartographer laid the overlay next to a modern district heating diagram and didn't say same. He traced spacing with a pencil and counted the rests. Every third valley, every day's walk, nodes where water once touched market walls. The old routes weren't holy lines. They were service corridors. Stakes turned practical. If the cores were hearts, then the grooves were arteries and the vaulted passages were lungs. Not a shrine. Infrastructure, district-scale heating and cooling without fuel, built from stone, air, water, and time. You didn't worship it, you maintained it. We walked ruins like plant rooms. Cistern became seasonal battery depending on placement. A shaded reservoir up valley drank winter chill and gave it back at late summer dawn when stores soured and tempers frayed. A sun-heavy courtyard mass bled its warm into the floor before sunrise in winter, a slow exhale that made joints stop complaining. Same hole in the ground, 2 jobs, 1 network. Aqueducts read differently once you listened for air. Cross-sections widened high and narrowed low where vitrified shards clustered, perfect for coaxing an airstream to ride water and trade temperatures along the run. At one bend, a faint glaze on stone sat exactly where eddies would linger. It wasn't pretty. It was tuned. We tested what we could without ripping anything open. Incense in a roofed caravanserai traced a path the steel had drawn in zigzags. Low pull along the floor, rise through a hollow column, slide under the roof, drop through little holes at opposite stairs. Prop both doors and the smoke sulked. Close one, and the draft found its lane. The floor lifted a half-degree in 15 minutes. Folk ritual, mechanical fact. Meanwhile, the coast betrayed secrets by being useful. Fishermen had dried nets for generations in a hall with no stoves. We logged humidity at the threshold as mist hung thick outside, 98 down to 81 along a line between the west slit and the stair mouth. Temperature barely moved. The cores kept their number, the air did the work. A child shrugged when we showed him the chart. "It's faster when the song is clear," he said, like he was telling us the price of bread. Impact felt stupidly obvious once written, a neighborhood comfortable without combustion. Peak loads flattened. Bills turned into wages for sweeping throats and receding lattices. You'd pay a mason and a metalworker, not a pipeline. Failure would be local, a blocked manifold, a cracked rib, not systemic. Someone with a broom and an ear could fix it before lunch. The cartographer found what he'd drawn years ago without meaning to, logistics embedded in distance. Node spacing matched a mule day. You could carry a replacement lattice from one heart to the next before evening. Bronze showed turn marks that repeated, like a speck driven by habit, not by decree. Someone standardized without paperwork. We roughed a retrofit with what cities already own. Cores as thermal capacitors seated in basements or vaults where spacing demanded. Waterworks doubled as exchangers, overflow channels that traded heat with air while doing their first job. Courtyards were chargers in winter sun. Singing halls weren't romantic. They were acoustic dashboards. If the pitch drifted, you didn't call a contractor, you grabbed a brush. Numbers played nice. From the unauthorized test, the crude cop sketched above should for a passive rig. Layer that across a block, mass in floors, tuned door logic, cleaned lattice, and you compound small easies into big savings, not miracles, margins that add up. We checked living fragments for stress responses. In the coastal hall, clearing reeds from the throat cut drying time by an hour on a wet day. In a hill monastery, opening west and closing east sharpened the tone and lifted floor temp by half a degree, repeatable across evenings. When a storm shoved pressure, the network breathed deeper and then settled, the way a chest does after stairs. What nobody publishes in glossy decks is how standards bury things by omission. Forms list boilers and furnaces. Anything else goes in miscellaneous, where insurance rates climb and inspectors frown. The trust's rendering erased an underfloor run with tasteful glass. The cartographer tapped the tablet and said, "They're airbrushing lungs," and we couldn't unsee it. Stakes widened. This wasn't one chamber. It was a language. Cities once taught air to do useful work and then forgot the verbs. The text told caretakers to judge by ear. Modern code has no box for pitch. It will need one. We circled 3 places that still pulsed. The net hall, a hill town whose winter floors didn't sweat. A tidal vault the sea had pried open. Proof invites pressure, and pressure had vans and NDAs. So we moved first quietly. We copied tones, drew throat sizes, measured door angles that made the good song. We left manuals where manuals want to live. Kitchens, cupboards, behind lighthouse books. Meanwhile, the map grew teeth. Overlay the nodes on poverty heat maps and watch lines converge. The people who spend the most on warmth live on the grid the old stones built. Put breath back there and you don't just cut bills. You hand agency to blocks that never got it. Here's the part that made us grin and then swallow hard. Nothing exotic was required. Lattice geometry over rare elements. Clay and bronze over patents. Apprenticeships over exclusives. That's exactly why polite fonts showed up fast. The network hypothesis wasn't a theory anymore. It was a plan hiding in ruins and songs. Breathe correctly and a city stops renting comfort from a hose. Keep both doors open for quiet and the night crawls into bones. The choice lived in ears, brooms, and code books. And somebody had already started writing the new code in pencil. The century of smothering. While we traced old roots in dust, a different map stretched over the last 100 years, paper trails and budgets that felt as deliberate as stone channels. The pressure didn't shout. It nudged, renamed, standardized. Start with a city that in the 193s heated its library with ground-coupled loops. First winter coal bills dropped by a third. A photo ran of kids reading without smoke. 6 months later, a pipeline consortium took the mayor to lunch. A price stability guarantee bundled with safety upgrades rewrote code. Flues required, unvented thermal systems prohibited downtown. The loops were grandfathered, then capped pending inspection. The inspector retired. A shiny boiler appeared. Crossed the ocean to a university lab in the 195s that built a masonry heat exchange rig inspired by medieval bath notes. Their white paper called it non-combustion district comfort. The next year, a petrochemical company endowed a chair in combustion research. The lab space became a new center for advanced fuels. Students who soldered copper on the prototype took jobs optimizing burners. The rig went into a hallway exhibit titled Heritage of Heating. Microstory: in the 197s, a professor secured a grant to test seasonal thermal storage under a housing estate. He pitched to industry partners in a room with free pastries. A week later, his dean said the grant had been realigned to national priorities. He found a new call for urban air quality that steered him toward exhaust scrubbers. He published on scrubbers. His storage design stayed in a blue folder that smelled like coffee. Meanwhile, standards committees moved goalposts. Lobby filings slid phrases into drafts that hardened into code. Acceptable heating appliances shall include boilers and furnaces. Unlisted air-moving devices are excluded from safety certification. That language framed masonry thermal networks as curiosities, inefficient, unproven, quaint. Planners flipped through handbooks and saw checkboxes for burners, not breathing stone. A nonprofit campaign in the 198s branded Clean Indoor Comfort, funded by utilities and energy partners. Brochures showed families by sealed gas fireplaces. A sidebar dismissed antique airflow as drafty and unsafe, citing erosion risk at ancient sites. The same phrase later wrapped our chamber. Words travel well. University endowments followed the river. Chairs in combustion dynamics multiplied. One building physics post, when funded, focused on insulation around gas appliances. A dissertation on low-grade thermal exchange through masonry earned kind marks and a shelf. The student modeled turbine blades for a living. No one plotted veins of cold in a tenure packet. Then came district energy standards. Committees formalized pipe diameters, pump specs, fuel classes. Ambient loop heating appeared as a niche with insufficient data for inclusion. A public comment asked for a pathway for non-combustion thermal networks. The reply was simple: out of scope. Shrugs bury as well as bans. Another microstory: a counselor pushed a neighborhood retrofit to cut winter bills. Engineers proposed reusing vaulted cellars as plenums, linking them to a modest aquifer exchange. Most cost: labor. A national gas provider pitched a district main with a teaser rate and a marketing budget the city couldn't match. The council voted gas. The retrofit plan slid into a binder labeled innovative but unfunded. Smear tactics stayed polite. Trade magazines profiled failed experiments in thermal storage with photos of moldy basements and captions about romantic but impractical ideas. Letters to the editor from concerned practitioners warned that uncredentialed exploration of ancient systems risks public safety. Insurance underwriters updated risk tables accordingly. Premiums for non-standard thermal installations tripled. All the while, another denial machine grew around a different fire: climate. Oil and gas outfits funded think tanks to sow reasonable doubt. That didn't target breathing stones directly, but it dulled urgency. If combustion's harms were fuzzy, moving heat without flame felt optional. Policy windows shut softly. Standards codified around burners had a second effect: talent. Bright kids went where grants lived. The best heat minds learned to squeeze another % from combustion cycles. Inefficiency got defined in a way only sources could fix: better burners, not fewer. The empty box where a breathing core spec might have lived stayed empty because nobody got paid to draw the line. In meetings, the phrase that kept showing up was inefficient curiosities. It sounded mild. It stuck. Talking heads used it to wave away passive thermal networks. It made a living system sound like a hobby. And when the coastal vault appeared, warm floors, dry nets, repeatable numbers, that label cracked. One discovery slipped through because nobody framed it as rebellion. People framed it as maintenance. A coastal chamber opened by weather. A town drying nets without smoke. No committee allowed it. No board granted it. It persisted by being boring and useful. You can't outlaw comfort your grandfather takes for granted. So yes, there were big moves. Lobby dollars endowed chairs, code language, but the smothering felt like sediment. Layer by layer, a story settled. Fuel equals warmth. By the time stones that breathe resurfaced, the sediment was thick. Yet sediment digs easy once a floor hums under bare feet. Then pressure changed shape. Heritage wrapped working rooms in mesh. Renovation plans cut underfloor runs to expose stratigraphy. Temporary HVAC units ensured stable conditions, throttling throats. Donor Tour handed out headphones with reconstructed songs that didn't match the real note. Kids noticed. That was the crack. From there, a different current grew. Quiet engineers started swapping manuals in kitchens. Councils heard residents ask why winter floors had stopped sweating after scaffolding. Inspectors with ears wrote new margins in pencil. Acceptable tone range, due threshold, door logic. Paper finally bending toward breath. The century of smothering hadn't built a wall, it had laid a fog. The map we carried cut lanes through it, one warm room at a time. The coastal vault. The storm didn't bring waves so much as weight. Wind shouldered the seawall until a seam gave, and at dawn 2 boys climbed down with buckets and felt air that wasn't morning, warm at the ankles, dry on the shins, while mist hung ghost-thick outside. Word crossed the quay in a minute. The old warehouse had a hole that breathed. Inside, the floor had stayed kind for days. Not hot, generous. Nets came in heavy from green water and laid across the planks. By noon, cords were light without salt crust, without the sour kerosene-reek old-timers still cursed in bad seasons. An elder shrugged. Always been like this if the wind's right and the east door keeps shut. The door was a stone lip with iron scars. It didn't look like a door until the draft curled around your boots and told you. Stakes moved from theory to habit. If a town had lived oil-free comfort so long it never named it, you weren't selling revolution, you were pointing at normal. That's exactly what money hates, comfort nobody can meter. Past the broken wall, the chamber sat modest and exact. 3 cores stood in a shallow triangle, basalt again, slimmer than the desert heart, linked at their bases by bronze manifolds that ran green on edges but shone where hands had worked them for years. The polish had a pattern, quarter turns, pause points, the kind that seep into muscle memory. Above, flues rose through thick walls and opened under eaves where gulls roosted. No soot fan, no oily feather. Nobody called first. Independent engineers, a Port Authority pair, and a university tinkerer who did building physics on weekends, walked in with boxes and respect. They taped thermocouples to each core, clipped hygrometers at mouth and mid-hall, set a simple vane anemometer in the throat, and stood still. Outside, humidity sat at 98%. Inside, along a line between the west slit and the stair mouth, the meter slid, 90, 86, 81, while temperature held near the core's stubborn set point. Floorboards read a degree warm. Nobody lit a flame. They pushed it because data needs edges. One engineer sealed the east lip with plywood. The note rose barely, but it tickled the soft part of the ear. Air speed at the throat climbed. On the downwind core, a copper pipe sweated into a cup. On the upwind one, cloth pinned to a rail crisped without scorch. The university man wrote the only phrase you can say without getting laughed out of a lab, coefficient of performance better than expected for a passive system. He didn't say free. He didn't need to. Meanwhile, the town ran its clock. A woman spread small fish on racks and set a kitchen timer. "They're done faster when the song's clear," she said, then caught herself and grinned at the word. A boy fetched his father's slickers sopping and came back for them light, no damp sadness clinging. The floor gave back what the cores pulled from air and wall. Bodies that had worked all night slept without chill nibbling at bones. Impact landed like a tide you realize only when your shoes are wet. Numbers repeated clean across a second day, then a third. Probes moved, instruments swapped, the hall misbehaved on purpose. Both doors propped and then snapped back when the old rule returned, west open, east kept. Maintenance over extraction. Geometry over fuel. The bronze manifolds examined close, showed turn marks and tiny drilled holes at regular intervals, primitive metering precise enough to teach an apprentice by feel. The cartographer saw a photo and laughed once, a dry bark. "Logistics," he said. "Those whole spacings match the distances on my old sheet." He meant mule days, swappable grids carried between nodes before evening. The elder, hearing none of that, tapped the manifold with a knuckle and said, "It sounds wrong when the holes clog. You brush them." Proof invited pressure. A letter arrived with a crest. Safety inspection, emergency stabilization, jobs, a visitor center. The renderings showed a glass walkway over the cores and a listening station where children could hear ancient songs. The slide erased an underfloor run with tasteful shading. The holdout engineer, who hadn't signed anything, traced the missing line with a finger and felt her jaw lock. Before scaffolding, the engineers stole every clean test they could. Door logic toggled, throat size shimmed, tone versus drying time charted. The good song sat at a pitch easy to teach a child. A reed bundle swept from the lip shaved an hour from drying on a wet day. A cord looped through a lattice notch thrummed when the network hit stride. None of it needed a motor. All of it needed hands. Micro-stories made it public. A school group walked through between squalls. Headphones handed out a reconstructed hum that sounded like a movie throat. A kid took them off, frowned at the actual note under the eaves, and said, "It doesn't match." His teacher shushed him. The elder met his eye and didn't. Cameras came. A spokesman said ritual acoustics into 3 lenses. The trust's brochure called the manifolds ceremonial plumbing. The port engineers exchanged a look you only see on people who have watched a pressure graph lie. The holdout carried a crookedly stapled manual under her jacket. How to seat a lattice, how to read condensation, how to judge pitch by ear, and slid it into a cupboard behind a coil of twine. Then Weather gave them one more gift. Another squall shoved the barometer, and the hall breathed deeper all on its own, like a chest after stairs. The note rose, smoothed, and settled. The vein ticked higher, then found its lane. On the board, drying stayed on time. A system doing what it was shaped to do under stress without orders. That was the part no crest could repaint. A small town used a humming vault to dry nets and clothes and to let the old sleep warm in wet weather. Oil-free comfort, embedded so deeply people forgot to call it anything but normal. And normal in the right light is the loudest proof there is. Pressure and betrayals. The first offer wore empathy like fresh paint. High-vis vests toward the quay, pointed at cracks in the seawall and promised repairs, local jobs, a visitor center with plaques honoring tradition. The contract tucked its bite in soft words. Emergency stabilization required temporary custody. Temporary custody meant exclusive access. Exclusive access meant the hall would breathe on schedule for donors, not neighbors. Stakes felt like kitchen table arithmetic. Fix the road, fix the pier, fix the roof if you sign. The council split down a familiar seam. Younger members eyed salaries. Older ones stared at the east lip like it was a relative being shipped away. In the back row, the independent engineers tried to swallow their answers and couldn't. "Secure the site," the letter said. "Secured," one muttered, means sealed. While that debate simmered, a side door swung quietly. A counselor signed a caretaker agreement. The other name on the line belonged to the same cultural trust from the desert, tasteful crest and all. The stamp thumped. Outside, applause met the promise of repairs. The elder who'd said the floor sang clear didn't clap. She set a hand on the stone lip. "Box a throat it forgets," she said, and went home. The microcost arrived with tape. Bright stickers bloomed on her steps. Condemned, unsafe structure, relocation assistance available. The assessment was dated 2 days earlier. A man with a clipboard apologized like Weather. She asked who walked her floor. He didn't answer. By evening, a fence leaned against her garden. "Temporary," they said. The wind snapped a loose ribbon like a tail. Meanwhile, the engineers got courtesies framed as gifts. A consultant called with a number and a smile you could hear. Short-term NDAs, generous consulting, a seat on the advisory panel. Help shape the narrative. 2 said yes. Mortgages and kids nod for you. The third, the damp expert, said no. Her inbox went quiet. Her grant portal flashed under review forever. Scaffolding climbed the hall like gauze. Mesh wrapped the mouth. Sensors showed up that measured vibration, not airflow. A portable HVAC unit arrived to stabilize conditions, its duct aimed right at the east lip. The note dulled. Press photos called the manifolds ritual plumbing. A spokesman said acoustic heritage and thanked donors. The words landed like pillows, soft and smothering. Inside the paperwork, the cuts hid in diagrams. A trench to expose stratigraphy crossed an underfloor run. A humidity control plan called for sealing wall vents. The holdout engineer visited the survey office, scanned the drawings, and found the absences. In pencil, she traced a grid within the manifold, the missing lattice. The bronze seats were there. The mesh was gone. She built one anyway. Clay ribs crossed at counterflow angles, cups for seats fired to a dull ring. In a basement rig, the lattice steadied the numbers and sharpened the good song. Bronze worked better. It rang when tapped. She wrote a manual in plain words, how to cast, how to seat, how to listen, and stapled it crooked. One copy slid into the hall's cupboard behind twine. One went under the elder's door. One hid behind a lighthouse book. Pressure sharpened by rumor. Insurance notices adjusted premiums for adjacent construction risk. A Facebook group bloomed with new accounts warning about dangerous experiments. A regional article called The Vault, an archaeological gem saved from amateurs. 2 former colleagues smiled in new vests. Their pay cleared on time. The trust staged a meet and greet. Pastries, renderings, internships. A slide showed glass walkways and a listening station. The holdout stood at the back with her folder, bronze lattice wrapped in paper. A donor asked if the song would be amplified for events. She didn't answer. She watched a cursor blink on the renovation plan and measured how far the line missed the old underfloor run. The smear arrived with a bored headline, "Ancient Battery Hoax Resurfaces." A professor who'd never set foot in the hall praised ritual acoustics and warned against unsafe tinkering. The trust reposted with thanks for responsible reporting. The holdout checked her phone. A calm voice said her name and offered one sentence, "Check your locks." The call ended. Night turned neat. Her basement latch lifted without splinters. The clay lattice lay in 5 perfect pieces. The bronze grid was gone. The box's wax broke like a snapped breath. An hour later, smoke crawled from the library's back room. The sprinkler failed once and then pretended it had never been asked to work. A shelf that held a crooked manual slicked black. The report box ticked electrical fault. The room had no outlets. Neighbors dragged hoses at the elder's place when a line along the eaves glowed and dimmed. The fire stopped in the kitchen. Morning brought an adjuster with soft shoes and a softer voice. The policy had lapsed under a temporary risk perimeter. He apologized like weather. What nobody broke was memory. The manual lived in 3 hands and 6 ears. The cartographer's overlay sat in a frame marked family at a second-hand shop. The graduate student's sketches rode the mail in envelopes inked by bored clerks. The lattice geometry walked into workshops as a rumor. Cross ribs, narrow widen, seat by the ghost marks, listen for the smooth note. Meanwhile, drying time stretched under scaffolding and the elders stopped pretending not to notice. A child took off the trust's headphones and said the recorded hum didn't match the floor. The spokesman smiled wider. The hall exhaled anyway. The holdout made one last delivery. She wrote in pen, thick paper, "If the files are gone, geometry is. Cross, alternate, leave room to linger and room to hurry. Seat on the old scars. If the tone smooths, you're close." She slid it under the council door at dawn. You can smear a person. You can burn a room. But once a town learns to judge heat by ear, polite fonts lose their grip. The song kept slipping under the mesh, and every time it did, another hand found a broom. The missing component. The lattice wasn't theory anymore. It was weight in a coat pocket and ghost marks in bronze. The holdout engineer laid photos of the coastal manifolds beside rubbings from the desert core and traced the empty seats we'd all stared past. Even spacing, shallow cups, a rhythm like teeth waiting for a gear. "They pulled the screen," she said, "left the frame." Stakes snapped into focus. If stability came from geometry, not magic, then anyone with clay, bronze, and patience could rebuild a heart. No patents, no rare metals, craft over commodity. That's exactly what would draw friendly fonts with locks. She started with what she could afford. Clay ribs rolled thin, crossed at deliberate angles, joints pressed into cups that mimicked the seats. The pattern wasn't pretty. It was counterflow, narrow where air needed to linger, wide where it should slip. She dried the grid slow, fired it to a dull ring, and set it into a plywood test cell over a dense slab standing in for basalt. 2 thermocouples, a manometer, a cheap coil, a hand fan, nothing fancy. First run, no lattice. The numbers twitched, then wandered. The hot face refused to dry cleanly. The note when she pressed an ear to the box wavered. Second run, lattice seated. The manometer nudged and stayed. The hot face dried faster and held. The cool face condensed in tidy pulses, beads forming and sliding with the patience of a metronome. The stone analog drifted less, returned to its favorite number faster. She wrote, hand steady now. Stability is a behavior coaxed by geometry. Bronze came next because clay chips when you're tired. She melted scrap fittings from a boatyard and poured into a sand mold carved with a hacksaw blade and a spoon. The grid rang when tapped. In the rig, response time tightened. Dendritic traces sketched on witness coupons, little frost ferns where air had handed heat across metal and mass. The estimate she scratched on paper, crude cop improvement, edged higher, not sensational, solid. Meanwhile, the text stopped feeling poetic and started reading like manuals. Brush the reeds from the throat. Judge by ear. Keep the clay plates tight. The plates were ribs. The throat was an intake tuned to match lattice resistance. The song smoothed when the maze was clear because turbulence had been taught where to live. She wrote a page on tone. Low and rough meant blocked. Thin meant leaks. Smooth with a faint shimmer meant right. She built for breakage. Curved joints spread stress. Ribs thickened at seats. Corners rounded to keep cracks from running. The clay grid took heat cycling in the school kiln and came out with hairlines that refused to grow. The bronze grid flexed a whisper without deforming. She tapped both with a fingernail and learned they sang different when tired. Maintenance by ear wasn't romance. It was QA without a lab. She called in 2 engineers after hours. One had signed the NDA and stared at the numbers like they might bite. The other leaned into the tone, smiled at the steady manometer, and said what builders say when a trick is teachable. "You could train apprentices on this." The NDA man exhaled, then told the truth nobody wanted to print. "They'll call it unsafe because it doesn't plug in." Action moved to a quiet cathedral of pipes, the coastal hall at night. With the elder's nod, she seated a small clay test lattice in one core where the seats matched, not in the way, easy to pull. Door logic set, west open, east kept. The note smoothed half a step. Drying time on a test cloth dropped by minutes in damp air. She pulled the piece back out and the metric softened. She seated it again and the curve sharpened like a chin. Repeatable, reversible, honest. She wrote a manual no committee had asked for. Plain language, drawings in pencil. How to cast a clay grid in a backyard kiln. How to pour a bronze one with scrap and sand. How to read a throat by smoke, a floor by bare foot, a song by teeth. How to seat the lattice on ghost marks and check for wobble. How to replace it with 2 people and a loop of rope. How to listen for the note that meant veins clear. Impact widened. If the missing component was shaped, not secret, then the road to a breathing district ran through workshops and unions, not pats and plants. Masons could become energy techs. Metal shops could turn out grids between railings and ladders. Inspectors could add a line, acceptable tone range, do threshold, door operation. Insurance could learn a new word, lattice, and stop calling geometry a risk. Meanwhile, consequences sharpened because fixes scared money. A smear called it ritual plumbing. A fire pretended to be an outlet. The bronze grid from her basement vanished into a car trunk that never showed on a camera. None of it touched the notebooks spreading like bread in quiet kitchens. Cross, narrow, widen, alternate, the elders told each other like a psalm. She mailed a packet to 3 city engineers who still wrote on graph paper. Inside, curves, lattice sketches, seating instructions, a note that read, "Behavior beats brand." One wrote back on a postcard, "We're listening." She returned to the hall with a bronze grid wrapped in canvas and a rumor of an inspection in the morning. The elder met her at the lip, set a hand on the stone, and nodded once. The grid dropped into the seats with a sound like a key finding home. The note rose, smoothed, and held. A boy in the doorway grinned. "That's the right song," he said. The missing piece was never mystical. It was a screen you could hold, cast, sweep, and teach. Which is why the last attempt to stop it wouldn't come with a brochure. It would come with force dressed as safety. The smear and the fire. The headline landed like a wet rag. Ancient battery hoax resurfaces. The subhead did the work. Ritual acoustics misread as energy device. A professor who'd never smelled the hall called it folklore engineering and warned against unsafe tinkering. The trust reposted with thanks for responsible reporting, and donors liked it between photos of gala wineglasses. Stakes got slippery. Once you stamp hoax, you don't test, you dismiss. The elders didn't read the piece. Their grandchildren did. Comments bloomed from accounts created last week, all repeating the same lines. Dangerous experiments, outsiders stirring trouble, leave heritage to professionals. The holdout engineer checked her phone and found a message from a number that never showed twice. A calm voice said her name, paused, and offered a courtesy. "Check your locks." Then the click. She stared at the basement door and listened to the kettle die. Night went neat. The latch lifted without splinters. Shelves leaned like someone who didn't need to run had brushed them. The plywood box lay open, wax rings snapped. The clay lattice sat in 5 perfect pieces, edges clean as a diagram. The bronze grid was gone. The cut on the coil looked like pride, clean, taped ends, no sawdust. The window lock showed a scrape and a shrug. An hour later, 3 blocks away, smoke walked the library's back room. The sprinkler coughed once and then pretended it didn't know how. The shelf that held a crookedly stapled manual, how to seat a lattice, went glossy black, then quiet. The report ticked electrical fault. There were no outlets. Micro story, the elder's eaves glowed like a held breath, then dimmed. Neighbors dragged hoses, cursing in the old way that sounds like prayer. The kitchen burned, then stopped shy of the hall. In the morning, an adjuster with soft shoes explained that her policy had lapsed under a temporary risk perimeter. He apologized like weather, the kind that never checks your roof. Meanwhile, the trust's brochure hit every mailbox. Safety first, erosion risk, exciting visitor center. A pull quote from the same professor smiled across the fold. Photos framed the manifolds in soft light and called them ceremonial. A render erased the underfloor run with tasteful glass. Impact cut 2 ways. The smear put a film over the air, but the hall kept breathing. Drying took longer under scaffolding and ducting, and people noticed. A kid tried the headphones at the listening station, frowned, and slipped them off. "That's not the note," he said. His mother shushed him. The elder tapped her cane on the warm plank and didn't. The holdout found her basement careful and empty and went to work anyway. She wrote faster, in pen, on thick paper, copying the lattice geometry and the seating notes, the tone cues, the reed brushing schedule. She slid one envelope under the council door, one into the net hall's cupboard behind twine, one to a cousin at the survey office with a memory like a ledger. Then the smear grew teeth. A podcast chuckled about stone batteries. A morning show host asked if ancient air conditioning was the latest scam. A blog listed signs you're being duped by pseudotech and used a photo of the hall's east lip. The trust thanked them too. While that was happening on screens, the town did what towns do. A woman checked the racks by feel and said the song had gone thin since the duct appeared. A boy timed the slickers and saw minutes stretch. A fisherman lifted a net and swore softly because it still carried a damp sadness that didn't used to linger. The elders shook their heads like the weather had forgotten a habit. Security made theater. 2 new cameras blinked red at odd intervals. A sign warned of prohibited equipment. A guard with a polite jaw asked the holdout for her badge. She didn't have one. He smiled and said he'd walk her out. She left the hall and doubled back through the alley to the cupboard, where the manual waited like a stubborn weed. Then came the fire that didn't hide. A skip bin behind the council office flared at 3 in the morning. The clerk's storage, maps, photocopies, permits sighed into ash. The firefighter called it arson and yawned because he'd been up all night. The survey cousin stared at the gray and whispered, "We keep backups," she had because she listened. What nobody counted on was how fast paper walks when people care. The lattice sketch showed up at the boatyard, folded into a parts catalog. The tone guide hung by a kettle. A mason traced the ghost seats with chalk and nodded like he'd been handed a forgotten chisel. The trust hosted a donor night. Canapes, renderings, a reconstructed song mixed in a studio. The hall hummed underneath with the wrong duct in its throat. The note sounded tired. A child pressed his ear to the plank and said, "It wants to breathe." A curator smiled and led him toward the headphones. The holdout stood in the doorway like whether the brochure hadn't planned for. She'd cast another clay lattice and wrapped it in dish towels. The elder met her eye, then looked past her at the guard and the cameras, then back again. A small nod. "Not now," the look said. "Soon." The smear had done its job on paper. The fire had done its job on shelves, but the floor still talked to bare feet. The note still told you when the veins were clear. That was the leak no press office could seal. And when people learn to hear, they start to ask the question that prize locks: what if we don't need their heat at all? What it means now. Here's the ledger without the brochure gloss. Heat is most of a household's energy bill. Shift it off gas and oil, and money stops flowing to pipelines and starts paying neighbors who sweep throats, cast lattices, receipt grids, and tune doors by ear. 1,000 small paychecks beat one distant dividend. Economics first. Breathing districts shave peaks and flatten demand. You buy maintenance, not molecules. Clay, bronze, stone, labor circulate locally. Volatile fuel surcharges vanish. Grid stress eases. Blackouts turn rarer because comfort isn't chained to combustion. Politics follows bills. Central heat is leverage. Local networks hand councils choices. Set tariffs to fund repairs, not profits. Publish tone ranges and do thresholds as code. Certify apprentices who can keep a block humming. Failure becomes sectional. One core slips, the next carries the slack until someone with a broom and a lattice arrives. Culture turns from fumes to notes. Winter mornings smell like bread and salt rope, not exhaust. Kids learn the good song before fractions. Inspectors carry tuning forks. Building permits add a line, breathing system operational, tone within band. Insurance adjusts when the data shows fewer fires, less soot, fewer flues. Craft scales. Masons learn counterflow geometry. Metal shops pour grids between railings and handrails. Plumbers become manifold techs. Vocational schools teach lattice casting and door logic. You don't need rare earths, proprietary controllers, or distant factories. You need repeatable shapes and people who care. Standards need a rewrite. Forms expect boilers and furnaces. Add pages for cores, manifolds, lattices. Define safe airflow, acceptable pitch windows, condensation behavior. Publish failure modes and fixes. The numbers are there: drying curves, crude cops, response to pressure nudges, quietly replicating in halls that still work. Winners and losers. The losers sell fuel. The winners sell steadiness, grids, gaskets, ribs, throat tiles, sensors that listen. Software will show up, but the heart stays analog, geometry coaxing thermodynamics to do a trick without flame. What about the myth fog? Skip free energy. This isn't that. It's proven physics arranged with patience, storage in mass, exchange in air and water, feedback you can hear. No miracles, just margins that stack until a neighborhood stops renting warmth. So the choice lands where it always does, in rooms with pens. Adopt the lattice, write the code, train the ears, publish the tones. Start logging songs publicly. The rest will be work, not wonder. They tried to bury a warmer, quieter city so fuel could keep the meter running. The rooms kept humming anyway. If you want the lattice geometry, door logic, and the first 3 neighborhoods ready to breathe again, subscribe. Watch the next episode where crews reopen veins, set tone bands into code, and hand heat back to people who can hear it.